Why is Formula One worth 5 times less than the NFL despite having a far more global audience? Well, it turns out there are many reasons from a business structure point of view that makes F1 very unlikely to become the highest grossing sport in the world. After all, in 2017, Bernie Ecclestone sold F1 to Liberty Media for a staggering $4.4 billion. But that is still less than half of the current valuation of just one of the NFL teams.
That's crazy.
For years, I have been that guy at parties who bangs on about how cool F1 is to a crowd of deaf ears. Even though I had been driving in various Formula Championships around the world, half my friends back home still thought I was a NASCAR driver. No offense, NASCAR community. Fast forward to today, and Netflix's Drive to Survive has created a frenzy around the sport in the US and Europe that I have never seen before. Especially in today's day and age, I've been wondering why my sport, with such a global and dedicated fan base, has been stuck as this pay-to-play environment when other sports like the NFL seem to be unbelievably flush with cash. I mean, even the NFL's lowest ranked team is worth more than F1's most valuable. So in this video, we're going to break down how these sporting giants and their teams are organized, how they make money, and why F1, despite its huge growth in recent years, has some huge challenges ahead if it's ever going to rival the numbers of the NFL. To get a sense of scale here, let's talk about viewership. How many eyeballs are actually watching these sports? Well, I had always assumed that because F1 is so global, that impressions would be fairly similar to the NFL, given almost all of football's audience is concentrated in the US, which represents just 4% of the world's population. Well, it turns out I was quite wrong. In 2022, F1 had a total viewership of over 1.5 billion, which equates to an average of about 70 million viewers per race. The NFL, on the other hand, averaged just 16.7 million viewers per regular season game. But considering there are more games in the NFL than F1 races, NFL had a total viewership of 5 billion in 2022. The Super Bowl championship game alone accounted for 113 million viewers. But it isn't just on-screen numbers that matter either. Stadium attendance is hugely important to the revenue figures as well. In 2022, 18.8 million spectators flooded NFL stadiums, with the Cowboys, for example, having a 95,000 spectator average for home games. F1 also increased their in-person attendance last year to a total of 5.7 million spectators, but with an impressive 247,000 person average per race weekend. Okay, so the F1 viewership numbers are considerably lower than the NFL, but how does that impact revenue? Let's not forget either that the NFL has a US concentrated audience, which happens to have the highest household consumer spending per capita in the entire world. So advertisers will be willing to pay higher ad rates to get in front of these American eyeballs. Even some relatively wealthy European countries have significantly lower ad rates than the US due to cultural differences in spending habits. And that's something I've noticed personally looking through Google AdSense data from this YouTube channel. So let's go ahead and break down some headline revenue figures. If we're talking about the championships themselves, F1 made over $2.5 billion in revenue in 2022, while NFL made nearly 4 times more at $9.8 billion. The teams themselves also have a huge spread in revenue. Last year, Mercedes was the team that brought in more than any other F1 team with $504 million in revenue. Whereas the NFL's highest grossing team, the Dallas Cowboys, brought in over $1 billion the same year. If we're talking about the team's total valuation, Ferrari actually supersedes Mercedes with a valuation of $3.13 billion. But that pales in comparison to the Cowboys' valuation of $9 billion. I mean, even the NFL's lowest value team, the Cincinnati Bengals, is worth an estimated $4 billion. If we're talking about the total values of these organizations and the teams underneath them, this is where the NFL really starts to stretch its legs. If you were to combine the value of F1 and its teams, we're looking at a respectable $32 billion valuation last year. Due to the way NFL is structured, we don't know exactly how much the organization itself is worth, but we can estimate that in combination with its teams, the league is worth at least $150 billion, 5 times more than F1. So not only are NFL teams simply worth more than Formula One teams, there are also a lot more of them. F1 currently comprises of 10 teams with just 2 active drivers each. The NFL, however, has 32 teams, with each team having an active 53 players on its roster. The NFL is then divided into 2 championships, the AFC and the NFC, which finally go head-to-head at the Super Bowl. This year, F1 will have a record-breaking number of Grand Prix with the addition of Las Vegas, which brings the total to 24 race weekends that spans across 38 weeks of the year. But the NFL dominates with a total screen time of 272 regular season games, 12 playoff games, and of course the Super Bowl cherry on top. Oh, and All of the regular season games span over a hectic 18 weeks. Okay, but how do these leagues and teams actually make money? Well, there are some key differences in how F1 and NFL structure this. So let's start with the 3 ways the leagues themselves make money. The big bucks for both is in broadcasting rights. While TV and legacy media often feels like it's dying, it's very much bigger than it ever has been when it comes to sports entertainment, with consistent year-over-year growth. And networks are paying big money to have exclusive rights to show these sports for their territories. To give an example of some numbers here, Sky Sports UK reportedly paid nearly £1.2 billion for a 5-year exclusivity of F1 broadcasting rights in the United Kingdom, which granted is probably where F1's most dedicated fan base per capita exists. ESPN also renewed their contract with F1 for the US at an estimated 75 to 90 million a year deal. But side note here, ESPN was only paying $5 million a year before Drive to Survive blew up the American interest. So it goes to show how impactful that series has been on the sport. Now, if we flip the coin here, the NFL number, as you may have expected by this point, is pretty nuts. In 2021, the NFL sold their broadcasting rights to multiple TV and streaming giants for what is estimated to be over $100 billion for rotating roster of rights between the companies until 2033. On top of that, YouTube TV also has a new Sunday night ticket package, which will pay the league an additional $2 billion annually. Both of these championships also make significant income from merchandising and licensing as well. In the NFL, all team merchandising in recent years goes through the league itself through a company called Fanatics, and teams receive a commission from those sales. Formula One and a handful of its teams also use Fanatics for merch, but the series also allows teams to come up with their own deals. For example, McLaren has a deal with Lego, or Ferrari has a deal with Puma. The third revenue source for the championships are league sponsors. If you've ever seen an F1 Grand Prix, you've likely seen a million Rolex, Heineken, or Aramco logos, which rest assured they have paid a pretty penny for. The NFL also has huge sponsors from just about any sector you can think of, but the technology sector is certainly bringing in the most revenue by far. Okay, well, despite the numbers being definitively higher on the NFL side, the ways in which these organizations themselves are monetized has been pretty similar. But there is, however, one additional stream for F1 that is quite different, and that is track fees, which accounts for nearly a third of F1's revenue. Now, the tracks that Formula One goes to actually have to pay the series to host a Grand Prix there, and depending on the country, these fees can be extraordinarily high on top of having to stomach the cost of setting up the venue in the first place. For this reason, most of these races are not profitable for the track, and government subsidy is often given since it brings all sorts of tourism revenue and residual value for the host country as well. You may be thinking to yourself, but wait a minute, what about ticket sales? Who actually is making the money there? Well, in the case of F1, the tracks themselves take on the risk and financial burden of hosting the Grand Prix, so they actually receive the income from concessions and ticket sales directly. The NFL operates somewhat similarly in that the income made in the stadiums, known as local income, like ticket sales and concessions, are the revenues of the team itself, depending on who actually owns the stadium and the teams deal with them as well. Because of the cost to actually build the stadium and the positive impact it has on the local economy, many of these stadiums are actually built and owned by local governments. Okay, well, let's shift to how the teams actually make money, and let's start specifically with how they receive payments from the leagues they compete in. Formula One operates as its own publicly traded for-profit organization, but it still shares a big portion of its revenue through a prize money distribution system. Some of the money is distributed as part of an equal payment to each of the 10 teams, but another part of the payment is related to performance in the Constructors' Championship. The total payout last year was a record-breaking $1.2 billion, with Ferrari receiving the most out of the pot at $200 million. The NFL operates as a trade commission, and the revenue it collects through the larger streams like broadcasting rights is called national revenue. Almost all of the national profit is then distributed to its 32 teams evenly, regardless of performance. In 2021, the total dollar value of the NFL's payout was $9.8 billion, or $309 million per team. F1 teams have their own sort of local income separate from the championship's revenue, and a few of those unique streams are very different from other sports. Other than the standard investments from private equity, like for example, Ryan Reynolds' recent 24% purchase of Alpine, some F1 teams receive investments from parent automotive companies, which obviously receive marketing benefits from having an association with the team that they sponsor, unless you were McLaren in 2015. Some of the higher end teams also build their own engines, which means that they can sell them to lower budget teams to recoup the cost of development. The lower budget teams also have a pretty unique income stream, which brings a lot of controversy to the sport. If a team is struggling financially, it's not uncommon for them to sign a driver who pays for their seat, and this has regularly been the case since the sport's inception. Some examples in recent memory: Lance Stroll's father, Lawrence, paid a whopping $40 million for Lance's seat at Williams in 2017 for his rookie year, which would have represented a huge portion of Williams' revenue that year. Others have perhaps done this slightly more subtly, like Nikita Mazepin's father sponsoring Haas through his company Uralkali, or Nicholas Latifi's father sponsoring Williams through his food company Sofina. Just try and take a second to imagine a world where graduating college football players would pay tens of millions of dollars to play in the NFL, and for one of the worst teams at that. Now, to try and reduce some of the pay-to-win aspects in both of these sports, the leagues have implemented some cost caps. For F1, this has been in the form of a $145 million-ish generic spending cap, but it excludes many high-ticket items like driver salaries, and it also leaves many costs up to vague interpretation. As far as I understand, it's made little impact on how much top teams spend, at least so far. NFL teams understandably spend a huge portion of their annual expenses on players, which obviously has a massive impact on overall performance. To level the playing field, the NFL issued a total salary cap on the active roster, which this year sits at a whopping $224.8 million a season. Now, there is some strategy that plays into how football teams utilize their annual budget, but it's allowed for lower tier teams to dig themselves out of the gutter multiple times in recent memory, unlike F1's cost regulation system has thus far. Okay, so I think we now have a good understanding of how money is made both from the organizations themselves and the teams underneath them. But what about the fans? How much does it actually cost to attend these events as a spectator? I'm sure this varies a lot, but if we're talking about your average tickets, the NFL has jumped up threefold in the past decade to $600 for a family of four to enjoy a game on average. I haven't been to an NFL game in about 10 years, so that number was pretty shocking to me. F1, on the other hand, varies a lot depending on the country, but standard 3-day grandstand tickets have an average price of $500. If you factor in the likely travel and lodging for the weekend, you're easily looking at $1,000 to $2,000 depending on the location, and we're talking about per person prices here. In a majority of cases, you're much more likely to incur additional costs going to an F1 race that you wouldn't otherwise likely incur if you're visiting, let's say, your city's local NFL team. But that's your average ticket. What about on the high end of things with suite tickets? F1 has various hospitality packages, and really the sky's the limit in terms of how much you can spend. But your, let's say, average Paddock Club ticket ranges from $7,000 to $12,000 depending on the Grand Prix. The NFL has suites in every stadium, and these cost anywhere between $10,000 to $30,000 a game during regular season, which makes F1 Paddock Club tickets sound like a bargain. Except that this is the cost of a suite for around 10 to 15 people, not per person. And in many cases, these suites are actually rented or owned by large businesses that can use the suites for hosting clients or prospective customers that they can easily make a return on. Formula One title sponsors like Rolex and AWS, for example, have suites at the Grand Prix as well. But as we know from earlier in the video, this takes a huge amount of sponsorship money to earn that privilege as a company. So what does any of this actually mean? And why is F1 less likely to build a bigger audience and earn more revenue than the NFL? Well, let's start with why F1 viewership is lower. I think the main thing here is that F1 has a huge barrier to entry, and so many new fans don't even know where to begin. On the flip side, over 5 million Americans alone play tackle football every year. There is a defined path of progression from Little League to JV to varsity to college, and finally a robust draft system directly into the pro league if you're good enough. Truly, in most cases, a talent-based system. Now, I'm not saying that every NFL fan is an armchair critic necessarily, but it's easier to follow a sport if you have some firsthand knowledge. Maybe you yourself were once a player, or you at least know someone who was. And if you live in an NFL city, the chances of you actually running into an NFL player are not that low. Very, very few F1 fans have that privilege. So they have to learn a painstaking amount on their own through broadcast commentary to understand how deep the F1 rabbit hole really goes. And I'm sure many regular viewers of this channel have experienced that for themselves. Once you're hooked on F1, you're hooked for life. But it takes some effort to get there, especially if you want to go beyond the drama side of the sport that Netflix's Drive to Survive seems to showcase. All right, but why will F1 struggle on the profitability side compared to the NFL? Well, for starters, F1 has higher costs with global travel and space race level car development every year. There are also far fewer races than NFL games, meaning fewer opportunities to sell tickets, merchandise, or TV advertising space. And if you really think about it, there are also only 20 active F1 drivers per season compared to the nearly 1,700 active football players. And each of those guys have social media that can further expose their sports to new fans. It may seem pretty obvious, but less eyeballs generally means less dollars. I think F1 will continue to grow and tap into the relatively small but valuable US audience in the coming years. But this is happening at the same time that the NFL is expanding its global audience, especially in the UK and Europe. But as a driver myself, understanding F1's challenges is particularly important because it can affect how we approach our sponsorship raising strategies. Look guys, this video took a ton of research, but I found it super interesting and valuable for me personally. But please comment below if you'd like to see this comparison made with other sports as well. So if you learned something today, consider dropping a like or subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the next one.